Nothing is more painful to the human mind than, after the feelings have been worked up by a quick succession of events, the dead calmness of inaction and certainty which follows and deprives the soul both of hope and fear. Justine died, she rested, and I was alive. The blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart which nothing could remove. Sleep fled from my eyes. I wandered like an evil spirit, for I had committed deeds of mischief beyond description, horrible and more, much more, I persuaded myself was yet behind. I had begun life with benevolent intentions and thirsted for the moment when I should put them in practice and make myself useful to my fellow beings. Now, all was blasted, instead of that serenity of conscience, which allowed me to look back upon the past with self-satisfaction, and from thence to gather promise of new hopes. I was seized by remorse and the sense of guilt, which hurried me away to a hell of intense tortures such as no language can describe. After reading Chapter 8 of Frankenstein, I thought to myself, you know what this novel could use? Brooding, more brooding, and quiet contemplation, melancholy, and some more Victor running away from things. Luckily, here we have Chapter 9 of Frankenstein. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for the 9th in an ever-going series on Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This video will have 3 separate sections: a So What Happened recap of this past chapter of Frankenstein, literary criticisms on the chapter, and finally, a writer's corner talking about all of the writerly goings-on from this chapter that we can learn as writers ourselves. So, what happened? We open with Victor complaining that he's still alive, and, fair, I guess, but Elizabeth is really sad, though she happens to mention how incredibly sad Victor seems. Also, Alphonse is really super-duper sad, though he mentions to Victor that he recognizes how super-duper-duper sad Victor seems. So, if you're ever trying to get away with manslaughtering someone, be sure to act the saddest and no one will suspect you. Finally, in order to make right for all of the tragedy, Victor decides to bravely go on holiday. I hear the mountains are nice this time of year. This is sort of a strange chapter in that it begins with some great withouts. The first 3 talking points I have here are for things that are strangely absent or notably absent in the chapter. So the very first page of the chapter itself, we have the paragraph that begins, "My father observed with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored by arguments deduced from the feelings of his serene conscience and guiltless life," whatever all of that means, "to inspire me with fortitude, and awaken in me the courage to dispel the dark cloud which brooded over me. Do you think, Victor," said he, "that I do not suffer also? No one could love a child more than I loved your brother." And it is strange to me that all of the reminiscing that Victor has been doing here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the times that Victor is really sort of going into a dark spell, it's because of Justine's death. He does not particularly mention the death of his brother. He goes off on these rants and talks about Justine, her death is my fault. But Alphonse and Elizabeth seem to be the ones who had focused on Victor's younger brother. And then it seems to be only Alphonse after that that focuses on his son. Everyone else seems to have moved on to the fact that it's so sad that Justine has been so wrongly convicted, not the fact that a young boy was murdered in cold blood. It is a strange absence from the sort of dialogue in this part of the book. Justine died. The very opening paragraph to this chapter. Justine died. She rested, and I was alive. Yeah, your brother's dead too. No, no thought of mentioning him. Your guilt, your guilty conscience is about Justine. It's just a strange thing. So the same page we get in the same paragraph even, Victor continues by saying this, or no, this is his father speaking to him. It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment, or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. Now, when I was getting my bachelor's degree, I had to hear about feminist theory all the livelong day. All of my classes, all of the time, all of the assignments, all of the sentences, every paragraph, feminist theory, feminism this, feminist that. So, just to be a prick, basically I started writing about masculine theory. One of the things that you will notice about masculinity as it is presented in literature, and we can sort of assert, therefore, masculinity in the greater sense, the societal sense, the historic sense, a man is considered a man, only insofar as he is useful. There is no compassion for men who are not useful. Sometimes this will take the guise of being the wise old man. Still, that wisdom has to be there. You cannot be an old man who has not accumulated or cultivated wisdom over the length of your life. If you are, you're worthless. And you are not a member of society that is worth saving. You are not someone who is a recipient of compassion. A man is only valued, masculine theory says, a man is only valued insofar as he is capable. So from time to time, the ideas of capable will change. It is, what's the old phrase? It is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. So this idea of being strong, this idea of being able to defend yourself is always the case, is always something by which men are valued. Should the tribe in the lands next door decide to come over, you need the big, strong men. But sometimes the idea of what it means to be a generally strong man, not a warrior, but someone who is worthy of society, worthy of place, all of these things changes. This novel, interestingly, pops up at a time where technology is really sort of taking center stage. That's kind of what the phenomenon of this novel, Frankenstein, is. The technology of bringing someone back from the dead, if we are to transpose this as a metaphor onto science, in World War II, you needed the big, strong men to storm Normandy Beach. But if it weren't for that wacky Einstein's brain, we wouldn't have had the bomb. and the bomb ended the war in Japan. It was not the big, strong, brave men who were fighting on the beaches, who were invading countries. It was the wacky scientist who invented the weapon. So back in middle 1800s, late 1800s, the idea of strength, usefulness, I guess I should use that phrase. The idea of usefulness was shifting towards the creative, towards the intelligent. The capable was intellectually capable, intellectually intimidating. So it is strange to get this little reminder in this novel of just that. On page 90 of my copy, we have so again, with the precarious moment in history whence Frankenstein springs, that idea of capable and intimidating and useful, these things are changing into a technological type of definition. Also, the ideas of religion are changing. The religiosity of society is changing. The when you have people like Mary Shelley and the retreat on which she went, daring each other to write ghost stories, this is something probably the hardest core of traditional Christians might not have done. So it is also a strange without, if you will, that we have a paragraph that begins like this. When I reflect, my dear cousin, Elizabeth said, on the miserable death of Justine Moritz, I no longer see the world and its works as they before appeared to me. Before, I looked upon the accounts of vice and injustice that I read in books or heard from others as tales of ancient days or imaginary evils. The fact that we are getting through an entire statement on tales of good and evil, an entire statement on from whence we get our ideas of judgment, from where we find morality, where we find ethics. We get through that entire spiel and there is no mention of the Bible. No mention of the Bible herein. So it is a strange bit of without. Indeed, it is that paragraph is without the Bible. And then the kissing page to this. We have Elizabeth talking, and she says, William and Justine were assassinated, and the murderer escapes. He walks about the world free and perhaps respected. But if I were condemned to suffer on the scaffold for these crimes, I would not change places with such a wretch. I listened to this discourse with the extremest agony. I, not in deed, but in effect, was the true murderer. I mean, how else do you explain, what is wrong with my hair? Look at this stuff. What else? How else do you explain manslaughter, right? You didn't shoot the gun. Well, you didn't. Maybe you shot the gun, but you didn't load the gun. We just had one of those in the news, didn't we? You. It's strange. You have the quote from Oppenheimer where he quoted the Bhagavad Gita. I am become death, destroyer of worlds, when the atomic bomb was detonated. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. Of course, you didn't drop that bomb on Japan. It was the military that did that. It was Harry Truman that did that. But how could you not feel the guilt associated with it? right? How could Victor not feel the guilt associated with this monster out there creating all of this havoc? How could Victor not feel guilty with his creation out there wreaking havoc on his very family? And then this is maybe on this same page, the very next paragraph. To the nearest of my recollection, I mean, certainly I haven't read everything. I haven't read a lot of stuff that's older than this, and I certainly haven't read many ancient texts. Is this the first mention of work addiction in literature? There is an expression of despair and sometimes of revenge in your countenance that makes me tremble, dear Victor. Banish these dark passions. Remember the friends around you who center all their hopes in you. Have we lost the power of rendering you happy? Ah, while we love, while we are true to each other, here in this land of peace and beauty, your native country, we may reap every tranquil blessing. What can disturb our peace? This is Victor, who is purposely and purposefully separating himself from the people that mean anything to him and dedicating his life to something. So that is just an interesting thing to the earlier parts of this novel. We certainly talked about how Victor had work addiction, but it was not, I don't believe, necessarily observed by others. Here we have it observed out loud and ruefully so by Elizabeth. And then the last talking point I have here is an observation from Victor as he is going on his retreat. The high and snowy mountains were its immediate boundaries, but I saw no more ruined castles and fertile fields. That mention of ruined castles and fertile fields. The castles are man-made. They're human-made. They were built by men. The fields, the fertile fields, are natural. The castles, man-made, they are in ruins. They are destroyed. What people make does not withstand the test of time. However, that which is natural, the fields, those are still lush. Those are still fertile. Those are still reproducing life. The human-made monster is there for destruction. It is going to fall apart like the castles. It is going to be ruins like the castle. Versus the human, the natural reproduction. That is what lives on. That was just I think that is an interesting small sentence from this book that kind of perfectly encapsulates the things which are going on in this novel. And it's little things like that we can often catch in literature. So I have to start this portion of the video where I have to start this portion of the video. I am not Mary Shelley. I have not written a book that has lived and breathed for 200 plus years. I have never started a genre of literature. I am no one to question Mary Shelley, but if we are to take writer's notes from a novel like this, the place where we can most readily start, instead of talking about the good stuff, is to talk about the questionable stuff. This chapter, I don't know how much literary goodness necessarily there is to be had here, or writerly goodness perhaps rather there is to be had here. Mary Shelley falls back into some of the wordiness, some of the separation from humanity that we get from her at times through this novel. We talked about that paragraph earlier. There was just a jumble of words. Like, it didn't really mean a whole lot when you're talking about what does it mean to a person to observe with pain the alteration perceptible in my disposition and habits, and endeavored by arguments deduced from feelings of his serene conscience and guiltless life to inspire me with fortitude and awaken ... We could talk about that sort of stuff all day long, and we could talk about dangerous writing, and we could talk about burnt tongue writing with that sort of thing. But where I really want to talk with this chapter is just this: how necessary is this chapter? What did we establish here? It seems to me that the reason for this chapter, above all else, would be pacing. We finished the last chapter with sadness and melancholy. It's been a long time since I've read this. Chapter 10 begins this way: I spent the following day roaming through the valley. I stood beside the sources of the Aveyron. So this chapter is simply a bridge between chapter 8 and chapter 10. It is the transition between the melancholy that ends chapter 8 and the vacation holiday fun that begins chapter 10. I say that's not worth it. Interestingly, so far in this novel, I believe the longest, by the standard print version, the longest chapter has been 10 pages. Most chapters are 6 or 7 pages. So we're getting through this at a very good clip. It feels bop, 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 bop. So I think the compulsion, perhaps, from writerly instinct would be to keep that pace moving. And in order to keep that pace moving, in fact, it would not surprise me if Mary Shelley were writing this. I don't know the entire story of how this was written. It would not surprise me if Mary Shelley, upon making this a novel, set out for herself something like a chapter per day because of that pacing. That pacing that seems to necessitate this chapter. However, were this chapter simply removed, what would we lose? There are no revelations at the beginning of the chapter where it's all melancholy and Alphonse and Elizabeth telling Victor, hey, you got to perk up a bit, buddy. There are no revelations at the end of the chapter where Victor decides to go off on his own. So, if you got rid of this chapter entirely and began chapter 10 with a paragraph saying, I had to get out, I went to XYZ, this chapter could have been absolutely eliminated. And so how important is that, right? How important is it to cut in that way? Well, it depends on who you ask. Ernest Hemingway certainly thought that it was worth the labor to cut everything you could. Ernest Hemingway has lived for over 100 years now through his printed works. That's not 200 years, but the art of publishing, the business of publishing, the practice of publishing has changed greatly since the time of Mary Shelley. And look, hey, you can pick up any number. Twilight, I'm not mentioning Twilight just to bash on it, but I'm going to bash on it because I read it for the channel. There's a lot of stuff in that novel that is terrible writing. But what I do have to say is that it is... Would you be better off cutting the entire novel from existence? Maybe. But it does move along. It does feel as if it were edited for content, perhaps not for language, perhaps not for artistry, perhaps not for actual strength of writing, but just from the top of my head, just from memory, just because I read it 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it does not seem to me that there was a whole lot of wasted time in that novel. It kept things moving along. This novel would move along better, faster, without this chapter. So I think that were Frankenstein submitted to a publisher today, probably they would put a big red X on chapter 9. Would they want the novel bad enough for their publishing house to say, listen, Mary, you can keep it, but we suggest. In the same way, no one is editing Stephen King's books. No one. I've read the last 2 he came out with. No one is editing that. No one is telling him anything. So, if you have your name, the same way Stephenie Meyer today could submit whatever she wanted and get it published. I don't know if you're watching this, probably you don't have a bestseller under your belt just yet. Probably. Not to say that you can't. I believe in you, right? We're both here together. But I think that in order for new writers to get published, oftentimes they have to be snapped tight with their writing.